So friends, we have a very interesting treat tonight. We have a guest speaker. She's an adjunct professor in sociology. She's an ardent student of Sri Ramakrishna, and that will be her chosen topic tonight. She was the editor or co-editor of the commemorational volume, which was brought out from the Vedanta Society here in 2012 as part of the new chapel inauguration. She's passionate about Indian classical music and is quite an accomplished vocalist. We've been lucky to hear her here on many occasions. Please welcome Donna Maurer.
Hi everyone. I see a lot of wonderful, familiar faces here today. It's really nice to see everyone and some new people as well. And I lived in Providence actually until about a year ago. I moved to Arlington, Massachusetts. So unfortunately, I don't get to come back here all that often, but I'm very happy to be here today talking about this topic of what we might call practical renunciation. And we're going to be talking about that in the context of the life and teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. So when Swami Agatamanandaji called me and asked me to give this Sunday lecture today, and he told me that it would be on the topic of renunciation, my immediate reaction was great, fantastic, that's a great topic. But after ending our phone call, I began to think about the challenges associated with talking about renunciation. For many of us, renunciation has a very mysterious aura around it. We might think of renunciation as just a lofty quality associated with a seemingly ascetic person or someone who's taken up certain religious vows. Thus, we might put renunciation on the proverbial pedestal, something way up high out of a normal person's reach, something maybe for the next life, maybe not for this life. I also imagine that renunciation might not be such a catchy title for a Sunday talk, especially with Swamiji being away and it being daylight savings time day, because it just sounds so very serious and austere, right? Renunciation sounds very serious and austere. And in a sense, on one level, yes, it is a very serious topic. But we can still take on this serious topic with a lighthearted and open-minded approach. And that's what I hope to be able to share with you today. I'd like to tell you something at the outset, though. Probably like many of you, I'm a very practical person. I want to think about and put into practice ideas related to self-awareness and change that could have a direct impact on scrubbing off and dissolving whatever it is that is obstructing the light or the higher self within me from coming out. So for me, finding ways to enact being a less selfish person is a very practical topic for the here and now. And so while some people might initially associate renunciation with monks and nuns, understanding it and practicing it, we can imagine that increasing the extent of renunciation in our lives is important and practical. In a very basic sense, giving up selfishness is the only way to experience true peace and joy in this human life. As Swami Vivekananda has said, this world is a huge gymnasium, and we have many opportunities within it to make ourselves strong. And these opportunities are nothing to run away from. Swami Vivekananda put it quite nicely. He said, quote, "The ordinary sannyasin, or renunciate, gives up the world, goes out, and thinks of God. The real sannyasin lives in the world, but is not of it. Those who deny themselves, live in the forest, and chew the cud of unsatisfied desires are not true renouncers. Live in the midst of the battle of life. Anyone can keep calm in a cave or while asleep. Stand in the whirl and madness of action and reach the center. If you have found the center, you cannot be moved." And again, those are the direct words of Swami Vivekananda. As we shall see, renunciation takes strength, It takes courage to examine ourselves and face the problems of life, which are essentially the problems of our own thoughts and behaviors. The occurrences of the world of daily life give us many, many opportunities to put renunciation into practice. So if we don't get it right one time, we'll certainly have the opportunity to get it right the next time. As many great sages have shared in one way or another, go ahead, make mistakes, make lots of mistakes, but just don't keep making the same mistake over and over again. So the goal for today's talk is to delve more deeply into the practice of renunciation in ways that might help us all think about how to implement or enhance this practice in our daily lives. The emphasis is on what we can call practical renunciation. In other words, renunciation is not just some abstract concept to be associated with monks, but it is something that each of us needs to develop in whatever way is appropriate for us as we each move along our own spiritual path. So in the rest of this talk today, we'll first be considering the concept of renunciation in general and exploring some of its various aspects and qualities, and then we'll be breaking it down into 4 components. Then toward the end, there'll be a few more words about putting renunciation into practice. And throughout, there'll be some meaningful quotes and anecdotes from the lives of Sri Ramakrishna and some of his disciples. So first, key question, what is renunciation? To renounce something is essentially to reject it, to have no part of it. But what are we actually rejecting? That's another key question. What are we rejecting when we renounce? We often hear about renouncing the ego, that we should reject this thing called the ego. But what is the ego? For anyone with a background in psychology, this idea of renouncing the ego might be especially confusing. Are there any psychologists here? I know Dorothy is in the other room, but we might have some other psychologists here who would know that in the field of Freudian psychology, the ego is the part of the human psyche that mediates the human desires, or the id, and the collective moral or idealistic standards, which is referred to as the superego. So from this perspective, the ego, from the Freudian psychological perspective, the ego actually serves an important and positive function in human character. And I'm not a psychologist, but having been exposed to these ideas, I always associated with the ego with this type of ego. In another sense, though, the ego is often associated with something completely different, which is the self that one experiences as being separate from others. And we could call this the self-centered self. Perhaps at one extreme, it's being boastful and full of pride. At the other extreme, it's what Sri Ramakrishna called the ripe ego, which is the ego of vidya, or the ego of knowledge. With such an ego, the ego of knowledge, the person is still an individual, so there's a minuscule sense of separation, and the person's attitude is that of a servant of God, a servant of all. It is a sense of separation from others that we seek to minimize through spiritual practice. Thus, in this sense, the ego is not viewed as an inherently fixed part of the person, as in the field of psychology, but more as a characteristic of the person, which could be larger or smaller depending on the person at any particular time. In other words, the ego is malleable, it's changeable, it can become larger or smaller, though we don't have any objective measure of it. It's the selfish part that keeps us clinging to the things we think we want, the part that leads us to get angry at whatever or whomever we perceive as obstructing us from getting what we want. It's the part of us that takes an us versus them, or a me versus you perspective. It's the ego that makes us feel that we are separate from others, and even in competition with others. So the ego, in the sense that we're discussing here, is also associated with pride. And pride, too, is another word that can be complicated in terms of its connotations. Actually, Often we hear about pride as a good thing. We're admonished often to, for example, be proud of our accomplishments or to be proud of ourselves. And just recently we were hearing a lot about Olympic pride. So we hear a lot about pride as being a good thing, but then there's also this saying that pride goeth before a fall, right? In other words, when we become puffed up and preoccupied with our abilities and who we think we are and all the great things we think we're doing, a bump in the road can bring it all crashing down. The reason is that the pride is misplaced. We think this separate individual person that we call I has done such a great job at something or has made a great accomplishment, and that we ourselves deserve the credit for it. One of the biggest difficulties with pride, I think, is that along with pride comes the expectation that people will tell us how great we are. That's also not to say that we should be falsely humble, telling people that our accomplishments are really nothing, while taking the credit for it within our own minds. Understanding humility can contribute to our understanding the nature of selflessness and renunciation, as we shall see. There's a really nice reflection on humility in the book called New Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton, who is a Christian contemplative. And I'd like to read a short excerpt from this book because it's especially relevant to our discussion today. So this is, again, from Thomas Merton's book, New Seeds of Contemplation. It was published in 1961. He said, "A humble man is not disturbed by praise. Since he is no longer concerned with himself, and since he knows where the good that is in him comes from, he does not refuse praise, because it belongs to the God who he loves. And in receiving it, he keeps nothing for himself, but gives it all with great joy to his God. One who has not yet learned humility becomes upset and disturbed by praise. He may even lose his patience when people praise him. He is irritated by the sense of his own unworthiness. True humility excludes self-consciousness, but false humility intensifies our awareness of ourselves to such a point that we are crippled by it. If you were truly humble, you would not worry about yourself at all. Your movements would be free. A humble man can do great things with an uncommon perfection because he's no longer concerned about incidentals like his own interests and his own reputation, and therefore he no longer needs to waste his efforts in defending them. Humility is the surest sign of strength. A truly humble person is sincere and genuine, and we can see this quality in the lives of all the great saints and incarnations, of whom Sri Ramakrishna is one. Throughout the many accounts we read of Sri Ramakrishna's life, he truly comes across as an exemplar of humility, who did not think of himself or fulfilling his wants. And he was certainly not at all concerned about being famous or protecting his own reputation. Rather, all of his focus was on serving the God in everyone. And we can read many accounts of Sri Ramakrishna's exemplar of true humility. In the book Ramakrishna, the Great Master, for example, his direct disciple, Swami Sardananda, writes at great length on his humility. And as an aside, for those who don't know, Swami Sardananda, who wrote this book, has a direct connection to us here in Providence, Rhode Island, because he, as far as we know, he was the first and only direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna to visit Providence, which was in 1897 when he spoke at Brown University. And I always like to tell this to people because many people don't, I walked by it many times that didn't know, a lot of people don't know. But so Swami Sardananda actually stayed at 9 Arlington Avenue, which is just down the street here at the corner of Angel and Arlington. So he has a direct connection to us. But anyway, in this short quote, Swami Sardananda well conveys Sri Ramakrishna's attitude and way of being in relation to others. How humble he was, how meek, how patient, how devoid of egoism. He would burst out, I am the lowliest of the low, a servant of servants, equal to a hair on your body. And saying so, he would immediately take the dust of your feet and place it on his own head. For as a matter of fact, the conviction that every being, from the highest down to the lowest, is God, was so firmly ingrained in him that the attitude of a servant of all living beings was normal in him. And that's what we would see again and again in the descriptions of Sri Ramakrishna's way of being when interacting with others. He had no sense of himself as an ego being the doer. The line of separation between himself and others as manifestations of God was extremely thin when he was in a normal state of consciousness, and that line of separation between himself and others didn't exist at all when he dwelled in higher states of consciousness. So, the smaller the ego, the more humble the person, the saintlier the person. That is, the less selfish the person, the less attached the person is to the outcomes of his or her actions, the more peaceful the person. Diminishing the ego doesn't mean not having a personality, however. All of the great saints have had their own unique personalities. One only needs to examine Sri Ramakrishna's personality and the personalities of all the great monks of the Ramakrishna order to see their unique temperaments, characteristics, and tendencies. In our humanness, there's a vast variety, tremendous diversity. So long as we are human, those differences are likely to be apparent to ourselves and to others. Non-attachment and not clinging to or identifying with the results of our actions also doesn't mean that we should be devoid of emotions. Practicing non-attachment does not mean being cold and callous. And Swami Vivekananda had some insightful words to say on this. He said, this is Swami Vivekananda, he said, there are people who are never attracted by anything. They can never love, they're hard-hearted and apathetic. They escape most of the miseries of life. But the wall never feels misery, the wall never loves, is never hurt. Surely, it's better to be attached and caught than to be a wall. We do not want that. That is weakness. That is death. So we see that renunciation can be characterized as renouncing the ego, which essentially means rejecting selfishness in its various forms, while remaining loving, caring beings with our own individual personalities. It also means not holding on to the results of our actions and not having selfish expectations. But wait, usually when we hear about renunciation in the spiritual context, we hear something like there are spiritual seekers who are rejecting worldly pleasures and material comforts. During Lent, for example, people might give up some particular thing like chocolate or meat. We hear of people giving up certain outer objects. Isn't giving up certain outer objects or material things part of renunciation? Isn't that part of giving up selfishness? It could be, but not necessarily. People can renounce objects for all sorts of reasons. For example, a person could give up sugar for Lent, not really in an effort to be closer to God, but because they actually want to go on a diet. And I did see this, and Lent, and they think Lent is a good place to start, right? And I actually did see this on Facebook. Right now, it's being the beginning of Lent, you'll see a lot of different people posting about what they're giving up. And so one of my friends said, this is a great time to start my diet. So there's still some renunciation here. It's not, making light of it a little bit. But the person is still, in a sense, controlling their desire. So there is some renunciation involved here. And we have no way to know the motives of another person, right? Even our own motives are very difficult to detect. And oftentimes, the selfish motives and the unselfish motives get mixed together. So the idea is that renunciation is not just action or withholding action. A person might seem to be renouncing something that they're actually really clinging to in their minds. Or a person might seemingly be very generous, but expect something in return. Also, many times people will say one thing and do another thing, or people will even say one thing and be thinking another thing. And maybe this sounds all a little bit overly analytical, but the idea is that we want to dig deeper to understand some of the various nuances of renunciation. And having gone through this short analytical dissection, we can now turn to some of the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. As Sri Ramakrishna emphasized, it's the mental renunciation that's key. Swami Shantatmananda, head of the Ramakrishna of New Delhi, wrote a very interesting short article on Sri Ramakrishna's view of mental renunciation. And the article is titled, "True Renunciation Relates to Mind." And it's so short, the article is so short, it's like a blog post. And it's very nicely expressed. So I'm just going to read this article in its entirety. Sri Ramakrishna would explain to his devotees what constitutes true renunciation. He would caution them about the misconceptions in this regard. He would say that true renunciation is related more to the state of mind, I point to my head, state of mind, and has less to do with the body. In this connection, he used to narrate a story. So here's the story that Sri Ramakrishna used to narrate to some of his disciples. Okay, there was a young monk who was known for his tremendous austerity. One day, he was resting during the noontime under a tree and was using a brick as a pillow to prop up his head. Two friends were passing by, and one of them remarked, "How strange is the renunciation of this monk? Even after becoming a monk, he needs a pillow to support his head. It's not a real pillow, but only a brick. But still, the monk is unable to give up the idea of using a pillow." Thus, the friends went away. They were going to a market to buy something. And on their way back, they saw the monk resting under the tree. And they were surprised to note that he had actually removed the brick that he had been using as a pillow. And his head was now just resting on the ground. And one of the friends remarked this time, "See the vanity of the monk? He cannot help responding to the opinions of others about him." Right? So, drawing inference from this story, Sri Ramakrishna would say that disregarding the demands of the body are no doubt signs of renunciation. But it's far more important to give up the idea of praise or blame rather than material comfort. Hence, subtler levels of renunciation actually relate to the mind. So Swami Shantatmananda draws us to a key point in this short article. Renunciation is an internal process. It's what happens within a person. It's the act of renouncing selfishness, renouncing attachment, renouncing likes and dislikes, renouncing fame and reputation. Again, we can look to the lives of the great saints and sages for inspiration on how to become less selfish and less attached to our wants. And in considering the different teachings associated with renunciation of selfishness, it seems to me, as I was thinking about this talk today, it was seeming to me that renunciation can be considered as having 4 different aspects, 4 ways in which selfishness can be renounced. These categories aren't what's called mutually exclusive. In other words, the categories sort of overlap. They also definitely relate to each other very much. Just having these 4 categories is a way not only to help Charlie be able to write his summary of the talk today, but also just it's a way just for us to be able to consider some of the different nuances of renunciation. So we might consider these 4 aspects of renunciation as, first, not running after things. Second, not running away from things. Third, not possessing things. And fourth, taking care of whatever things are entrusted to us. So let's take a brief look at each of these 4 categories. The first is not running after things. We might think of the core of selfishness as continually running after the things that we think will make us happy. It's all the wants that we have that lead us to get drawn out of ourselves and seek to grab the things that we think will make us happy. And once a particular desire is filled, the mind momentarily returns to its natural, calm state until another desire pops up. And, in yoga practice, we all, in Vedanta, we all know this is a very common, basic idea. And many people think of fulfilling desires is a wonderful thing, and that a person with no desires is boring and has no sense of adventure. But really, it's just the opposite. By not running after things, what are we doing? Well, first, we're certainly conserving a lot of time and energy. We also have the opportunity to experience contentment because the focus turns away from what can be gotten and towards what is happening in the present moment. In this way, we can experience life as a great adventure, from the little things in life to the seemingly monumental moments. And with this attitude, we can view life as the ongoing movie that it is. And whether it's being a comedy or a drama or an action film, whatever, we can be the witness to all those interesting things that happen. And Sri Ramakrishna told a wonderful story on the nature of desire in a parable. A parable we can call the jar of desire. And some of you might be familiar with this story already, but it's great. It's a little bit long story, but I have to share it because it's so good. So this is Sri Ramakrishna parable. A barber was passing under a haunted tree and heard a voice say, "Will you accept 7 jars full of gold?" The barber looked around, couldn't see anyone, but the offer of 7 jars caught his attention. And he cried aloud, "Yes, I will accept the 7 jars." And at once came the reply, "Go home, I have carried the jars to your house." People know this story? I don't know. No? Oh, wow, okay, this is great. Okay, so the barber, having heard this, ran home immediately to verify the truth, whether this strange announcement was actually true. So when he entered the house, there were the 7 jars. He opened them and found that they were all full of gold, except the last one, which was only half full. So 6 full jars of gold, wow. 7th jar, only half full jar. A strong desire now arose in the barber's mind to fill the 7th jar too, for without it, his happiness was incomplete. He therefore converted all of his jewelry into gold coins and put them in the jar, but this mysterious vessel remained unfilled. This exasperated the barber. Starving himself and his family, he saved some amount more and tried to fill the jar. The jar remained the same, stayed half full. So one day, he humbly requested the king to increase his pay, as his income was no longer sufficient to maintain himself. Now, the barber was a favorite of the king, and so as soon as the request was made, the king doubled his pay. And the barber put all this extra pay in the half-filled jar, but jar never got filled. Months passed. Condition of this miserable, unhappy, and miserly barber grew worse every day. Seeing his sad plight, the king asked him one day, "Hello, when your pay was half of what you got, you were happy, cheerful, and contented. But with double that pay, I see you morose, careworn, and dejected. What's the matter with you? Have you got the 7 jars?" The barber was just taken aback by this question and replied, "Your Majesty, who has informed you of this?" And the king said, "Don't you know there are these signs, that these signs are the signs of the person to whom the yaksha consigns the 7 jars?" I think, from what I understand, a yaksha is like a spirit that lives in a tree and has treasures under the ground. Is that, anyone? I don't know. That's a yaksha. So there's a spirit. Oh, you know, okay. Yeah. So anyway, he said, "Don't you know that these are the signs of the person to whom the yaksha consigns the 7 jars?" He also offered me the same jars, but when I asked him whether this money might be spent or was merely to be hoarded, no sooner had I asked this question than the yaksha ran away without any reply. Don't you know that no one can spend that money? It only brings with it the desire of hoarding. Go at once and return the money. The barber was brought to his senses by this advice, and he went to the haunted tree and said, "Take back your gold, O yaksha." The yaksha replied, "All right." When the barber returned home, he found that the 7 jars had vanished as mysteriously as they had been brought in, and with it had vanished his lifelong savings too. So everything was gone. This parable of Sri Ramakrishna so nicely conveys to us the nature of running after things in an effort to possess them. Not only are such efforts futile, but running after one thing tends to make us want to run after more and more things. There's no end in sight. And in the process of running after wants, we give up our peace and contentment. So the flip side of not running after things, first aspect of renunciation, the flip side, or the second thing, is not running away from things. In Vedanta teachings, we hear a lot about fulfilling one's duties. Duties are our roles and obligations in life. In fulfilling one's duties, one also has many opportunities to renounce selfishness and attachment. As Swami Vivekananda admonished us in the quote at the beginning of the talk, the quote I gave earlier, by renouncing the ego, we're not running away from life. We're engaged in activities to strengthen our character and to become less preoccupied with the trivialities of our likes and dislikes, and to become more centered on serving other people. So in the following dialogue from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we learn Sri Ramakrishna's approach to how to engage in the activities of daily life. And in this dialogue, as many of you know, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, there are lots of different dialogues between the people who are visiting him, and he's giving much sagely advice. A lot of the conversations also relate to things that might seem mundane, but actually are not mundane. So this is one of those little dialogues that's happening in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna between Sri Ramakrishna, who is called Master in this dialogue, and Adhar, who is a devotee. Okay, right, so what we're learning is how to approach the activities of daily life. So Adhar entered the room, saluted the master, and sat down. He had not come for the past few days. "Master, hello, why haven't you come all these days?" Right? "Adhar, sir, I have been busy with so many things. I had to attend a conference of the school committee and various other meetings." Does this sound familiar? It's amazing to think that this was 150 more years ago. It's a conversation you could imagine happening right now, right? So, Master, so you completely lost yourself in schools and meetings and forgot everything else? Adhar, everything else was hidden away in the corner of my mind. After a time, the master suddenly said to Adhar, "Look here, all these are unreal. Meetings, school, office, and everything else. God alone is the substance, and all else is illusory. One should worship God with one's whole mind. All else is illusory. This moment, the body is, and the next moment, it is not. One must make haste to worship God. But you don't have to renounce everything. Live in the world the way the tortoise does. The tortoise roams about in the water, but keeps its eggs on land. Its whole mind is on the eggs." So in this way, Sri Ramakrishna is again reinforcing the idea of mental renunciation. As such, a person engages in activities in the world while at the same time preserving, and keeping an awareness of truth. The next aspect, or the third aspect, is not possessing anything. Having the feeling that nothing and no one belongs to us. Thus, while serving others, even those near and dear to us, it's important to keep the view that they're not ours. Swami Dayatmananda, head of the Vedanta Society of the UK, wrote a beautiful essay that delves deeply into this topic. And again, here I'd like to, there's so many wonderful things just in preparing this talk, so many wonderful things that people have written, really wise people. And so sharing today, I really am happy to be able to share them all with you. So that's why I have these quotes, but they're so beautiful. So this is from Swami Dayatmananda. Most of the spiritual aspirants in the world are householders, having many duties, responsibilities, and the inevitable worries. If one does not know how to detach the mind, at least to some extent, it is impossible to focus the mind on God. One must discharge one's duties with great love and care. No one can attain the state of inaction except by going through the field of action. For most people, it's not possible to stay quiet, to stay and sit quiet. The field of action strengthens one's character. Right attitude, concentration, tranquility, and devotion. With these, every action is transformed into spiritual practice. Sri Ramakrishna's advice to serve one's parents, etc., with great love and reverence, as if they were dear to you, is not make-believe. He is merely cautioning us not to fall into the trap of attachment. Many devotees think that they are serving their parents, their family, etc., with detachment. This can be pure deception, pure self-deception. When things are going on well, they think that they're progressing spiritually, but let there be a slight trouble, immediately they're overwhelmed. The test of detachment can be found in tranquility of mind. So here again, we come back to the idea of mental renunciation. Engaging in our activities and caring for others, but not getting caught up in the web of attachment. Of course, not possessing things includes not just the people in our lives, but objects too, including the physical body, as well as our own plans and our own fears. When we feel that we own things, we get caught up in efforts to protect them from being taken away from us, which takes much energy and distracts us from the oneness that underlies everything. There's a wonderful story that conveys this idea that attachment and possession keep the ego in a state of separation. And I've heard this story, different variations of this story. I've heard Swami Vivekanandaji tell it. I've heard Vishwanath tell it, who's not here today. I've heard Swami Tyagananda tell it. So I know that there are slightly different versions of it. So I've sort of amalgamated the different versions that I've heard. Because in one it's a man and one it's a woman. I don't know. But here's the story. You know, many times with these wonderful stories, it's not the details that are so important. It's the underlying message that we get from hearing the story. So here it is. Once Lord Krishna and Arjuna, his student, went incognito to the house of an important wealthy landlord and asked for alms. The man refused and insulted them. As Lord Krishna was leaving, he blessed the landlord, saying, "May your wealth increase tenfold." So then the two heroes moved on, and they then saw this poor woman milking her cow. Poor meaning, lacking in material wealth. And Krishna asked her if she could spare some milk for Arjuna, and she happily gave him all the milk that she had. And Arjuna was very pleased and asked Krishna to bless her too. And Krishna then said, and I know, you know the punchline. Krishna then said, his blessing to the woman was, "May your cow die." What? And Arjuna was just like, how could you possibly give her that kind of blessing? What is that, right? Your cow die. He was just unable to understand. And Krishna said, Arjuna, that landlord who refused us, he's already rich. He's arrogant. And if I give him, the landlord, more wealth, he'll just become infatuated with me. And that will be his, side note is that's his way to find God, right? But this poor, pious woman is attached to only one thing, and that's her cow. If her attachment, right? If her attachment to the cow perishes, then the woman will be completely undivided in her devotion, and she will attain liberation. So whatever the source of attachment is in our lives, it can obstruct us from reducing the ego. So the idea is to take care of people and things in our lives without getting bound to them. And this brings us to the fourth category. And the fourth aspect, which is taking care of whatever it is that's entrusted to us. And in a way, this aspect relates back to performing our duties and not running away from them, as we should be taking care of whatever roles and obligations we have in life. But taking care is also having respect. And this means paying attention and not being wasteful of things. Sri Sarada Devi, the wife and spiritual consort of Sri Ramakrishna, is a great exemplar of living a practical spiritual life, of being in the world but not of the world. And this short segment from the writing of Swami Nikhilananda well conveys the Holy Mother's practical approach to taking care. And I know many of you have probably heard these little anecdotes here. Holy Mother highly disapproved of carelessness and waste. One day, after sweeping the courtyard in Jarambati, someone threw the broom aside carelessly. I mean, how many times have we done that? You think, oh, my job's done, okay. And she reprimanded the person, saying that the broom should have been treated a little more gently. Everything should be shown proper respect. On another occasion, she expressed her displeasure because an empty basket was thrown away by one of the resident monks. She said to the monks that being world renouncers, they might not care for a trivial thing like a basket, but nevertheless, it should be preserved for some other useful purpose. One day, she gave a disciple a special dish of food that she had prepared, and the quantity was just too great. He ate what he could, and he was about to throw the rest away. And she said to him to give it to a poor neighbor that would enjoy the food. And what she told him afterwards was, we should give everyone his due. What's not edible for a man, give to a cow. What's not edible for a cow, give to a dog. What's not edible for a dog, throw in the lake for the fish to eat. But never waste. And this is actually, I think, an aspect of renunciation too, is really paying attention to everything in our lives, okay? Everything that's been entrusted to us. And so this means not just doing actions out of our own personal convenience or for our own wants, but out of being respectful to everyone and everything that comes into our lives. And it also means taking good care of our physical bodies, because the physical body is something that's also been entrusted to us. So we find that renunciation has multiple aspects to it. Again, not running after things, not running away from things, not possessing, and taking care of whatever comes into our lives. So, some practical steps. What kind of practical steps can we take to become less selfish in daily life? How can we practice renouncing this egotistical part of ourselves? Doing this is not really just a decision to act a certain way. It's a practice. Sri Ramakrishna told his devotees, quote, "It's not possible to acquire renunciation all at once. By constantly hearing about renunciation, one's desire for worldly objects gradually wears away. And as your attachment to the world diminishes, your spiritual knowledge will increase." Sri Ramakrishna often suggested that we take time in solitude, away from our daily activities and interactions, to stay connected with our spiritual selves. For people who don't live alone, this may mean seeking out time for physical solitude. All of us, even those of us who do live alone, can benefit from the solitude associated with going deep within ourselves in the practice of some form of meditation. By taking time alone, we give ourselves the opportunity to learn to keep the awareness inside, so that the mind, over time, will become less oriented toward going outward, toward the objects of the world that it may then want to acquire and possess. Also, Sri Ramakrishna often recommended spending time in holy company. Surely, holy company means the physical presence of people who possess saintly qualities. But we can also be in the company of these individuals when we read their words or even when we view their photographs. Also, though, holy company refers to being in the company of others who are also aspiring to develop saintly qualities in their life. When we're with others who have the same goals as we do, this can help us keep on track, as we're reminded again and again of the virtues to which we're aspiring. We can also work on our likes and dislikes, and on reducing our feeling of possession. And this is where creativity can come into play. Try doing something that you don't like, right? Try doing something that you dislike. Try not doing things that you like. Also, give freely. If you're a person who has a tendency to collect things, try giving some things away and see what happens, right? What makes it easier to be unselfish? Love, devotion to God, devotion to an ideal, or even devotion to humanity. If we see God in all, if we see love in all, then it's easier to be unselfish, because what one does for others, one is truly doing for all, including oneself. Also, we can't know these things about our journey and our actions unless we seriously examine ourselves. And I don't mean taking this on as a preoccupation, but rather as a dispassionate self-reflection. Other people may examine our words and actions and give us feedback, and that can be very useful. But only we ourselves can examine our own thoughts and our own true motivations. It's relatively easy, for example, to act humbly or to say that we don't want some thanks for some good work we've done. But then what does the mind do? It's really important not to avoid examining ourselves and to not fool ourselves about our true motivations. For all of recorded history, people have experienced suffering and conflict, loss and frustration. Many consider suffering to be inherent to the human condition. In an article appropriately titled, "Peace, for which mankind has yearned throughout the ages," Swami Swahananda, the late head of the Vedanta Society of Southern California, eloquently stated the following: "Lasting peace cannot be found in the external world. In fact, it is our identification with the external world that causes inner conflict and anxiety. Peace comes through detachment and renunciation." This is true regardless of what religion a person practices, or regardless of whether a person has any spiritual belief at all. Everyone wants to be peaceful. Everyone wants to be free. So may we all receive the guidance that we need to become less selfish, more loving, and more peaceful in this human life, so that we can be more open to whatever grace comes to and through us, and so that we can move closer to the state of being liberated from all suffering. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om peace, peace, peace. Thank you very much. Thanks.